Hello and welcome to this final video in this course exploring the theology of Andrew Shanks. So what was all that about? The theology of Shanks, the idea of truth as openness being the highest kind of truth, which cannot be contained by any particular truth as correctness, and the prospect of fostering the greatest possible solidarity of the shaken, a reality necessarily bigger than the church, so calling the church to understand its vocation as contributing to a larger ideal. What on earth was all of that about? To draw some of it together, I'm going to talk about it in terms of a conversation, a gospel of conversation, because that's one way of making sense of it. So think of our world as a world which is too often closed down to proper, authentic, honest conversation. There are all sorts of ways in which deep conversation is simply too much for us to bear, too difficult to engage in, too demanding. So we edit the conversation. We edit it, we limit it, we close ourselves off in three particular ways, which Shanks calls dishonesties. And the reason they are dishonest is because they shut us off to the fullness of reality. So they prevent us from engaging as honestly as possible with reality as it is. The first one is dishonesty as manipulation, where some people decide what the rest of us should be talking about. It serves their interests to have us focus on some things and not others. Even to regard some people as outsiders, people who can be silenced or even sacrificed in order to maintain the status quo. A status quo which serves their interests, but we go along with it because we're seduced or threatened by their version of reality. And this plays out in our politics, our economics, our power dynamics between men and women, between different ethnicities, between different nations and sexualities. People with power tell other people this is how things should be, and it takes too much to push against it. This is the libido dominandi at work, the will for domination. But Jesus did push against it, and it cost him. He exposed the structures of domination, so they executed him as an illustration of their propaganda. But he couldn't be silenced or contained. God shows solidarity with the victims of all such systems, and shows that reality can't be put in a box to serve the interests of those who dominate. So the church should learn to respond accordingly, to witness to this anti-domination impulse, to stand in solidarity with the silenced and oppressed, undoing dishonesty as manipulation, doing justice, fostering holy anarchy, God's kingdom where there is no domination of some over others. This is good news. But the second dishonesty is also at play, where one group assumes that its own truth, its own way of seeing things, this is the very truth of things. So it shuts itself off from other possibilities. Whether as a culture or a tribe or a religious community, we tell ourselves this is reality, and we are indifferent to the truth potential outside of us. We say love your neighbour, but we basically only mean people basically like us, and we hold at bay those who are too different, too awkward. This plays itself out in our politics, our community identities, our religion. Even when we profess that we belong to the very tradition which can solve the problem, because even when we're alert to dishonesty as manipulation, even when we say our story is the one which defeats domination, we still fail to see how we are conditioned by an impatient version of truth. But God confronts this and exposes it. God reveals God's self as bigger than all our containers, all systems of thought. God extends beyond us and them. God brings us into conversation even with those who are strange to us, urging us to xenophilia, loving across borders, a deeper loving kindness as we listen and learn and grow and change, while also telling our story too. So this dishonesty as banality, this unthinking going with the flow of our own conversation, is broken open and the conversation is extended. This is good news. But thirdly, there's another dishonesty, the third one, dishonesty as disowning, where an individual or a community tries to whitewash its story, to paint over the cracks or sweep certain parts of it under the carpet. In effect, seeking to disown parts of who we are, the messy parts, the failures, the pain, the silencing, the shadow side. Because we prefer to tell ourselves a version of reality which makes us feel good, a way of doing conversation with one another which keeps it upbeat, even if superficial. So we overlook the deeper realities by staying on the surface. But the Spirit of God won't let us stay there. The Spirit of God leads us into all truth, even uncomfortable truth, even truth we'd rather not face, so that we must confess more fully the pain of who we have been and the pain we have caused to others. And we work out how to hold the different voices in tension. In fact, we learn how to be a genuinely Catholic community with a small c, a community of all voices, genuinely distinctive in the case of the Christian Church because it's a community centered around the life of Jesus. But to have the conversation about what that means involves listening not just to the usual suspects, but to all sorts, and living with the ambiguities of our Christian identity, the tensions, learning to be a community which holds diversity together and which has room for all of life, walking humbly, not boastfully, with our God. This is good news. So we need all three of these cautions, alertness to these three dishonesties, because we may feel we're addressing one, or maybe two, without recognizing how another affects us. And in fact, the existence of all three shows us how insidious and prevalent it is, our editing of conversation, for all sorts of understandable reasons, but that whenever this happens, there are consequences, directing us away from the fullness of reality, closing down the possibility of greater empathy between us. Just as there are also consequences in being opened up too, because the more we are confronted with reality in all its awkwardness, its pain and diversity, the more we trust, the more we must make decisions about how to be, even who we want to be. And even our decisions will show that the dishonesties continue to operate, because our decisions about how to respond to them involve dealing with the mess and ambiguity of reality, getting our hands dirty or trying not to, being hypocrites of one sort or another. So we can't escape the issues, and Shanks doesn't pretend that we can. Rather, the challenge is to recognize them, to be alert to them, and appreciate how, inspired by God's truth as openness, we can seek to move in more hospitable, more loving directions, so that all of life can flourish more fully. So the gospel, and being a community shaped by the gospel, is a challenge, a scandal, because it confronts us with the truth that God cannot be contained by our limited versions of the conversation. God confronts the bullies, the manipulators, the powerful who try to close it down in the service of their own interests. And God transgresses the boundaries of any herd mentality, any groupthink, any unthinkingly banal or cliched tribe, opening us up to affirm the truth potential of others, and to learn to love them, and to love to learn from them. And God won't be contained by an edited conversation about our own identity, because God was there in those silenced voices, in the experiences of those who suffered under our shadow side. So God brings to the surface, God illuminates all of reality, all of our reality, even when it doesn't feel like good news. Because the good news is that God can cope with it all. God can receive all of it, and God urges us to receive all of it too, to face the fact that God is open to it all, and the fact that that places demands on us, moral demands, because it confronts us with the realities which don't fit with what we know, which require us to be empathetic and in solidarity with other experiences. So the gospel opens us up to love not only God, not only neighbour, but other sorts of neighbour and even enemy. It opens us up to witness to God's scandalous love, and to dare to imagine that such love works in us too, and beyond us, in them and at large. But this is a challenge, a real challenge, because while we remain conditioned by more limited versions of reality, more limited conversations according to our truth as correctness, our way of capturing the truth of things, God, by contrast, demonstrates a higher truth, truth as openness. Such generosity of spirit, such hospitality, such graciousness, loving creation in all its otherness and awkwardness and mess. And even our very traditions, even Christian faith itself, designed to expose these limitations, designed to open us up more lovingly, even this can be conditioned by the problem, which he calls unatonement, the condition of being cut off, not at one, the condition of being resistant to the demands of an ambiguous and messy reality, which doesn't fit our particular lens. Even Christian faith can be affected by the very problem it tries to address. So the church has sometimes assumed it is the kingdom of God, rather than acknowledging that there is a real gap between its own life and the reality to which it witnesses. Or the church has shut itself off from the truth potential beyond itself, or it has denied its own messiness, its own fragility or frailty. But even in such weakness, we can nevertheless witness to the larger ideal. We can be a sign, a foretaste, and an agent of the solidarity of the shaken, the realm where God's will is done, where domination is undone, where boundaries are not the end of the matter, where our own story is re-examined so we learn to be as honest as possible. Of course, it's vital to remember that truth as correctness always has a role. We need ways to explain our story, our identity, our purpose. So truth as correctness in itself is not the problem. The problem is when we think that truth as correctness is the very truth of things. But doctrine or an interpretation of scripture or how we worship right now or the content of our morals, none of these things is in themselves the very truth of things. Rather, our language, our dreams, our aspirations, they seek to point to the greater truth, the ultimacy of God's truth as openness, God's scandalous hospitality to all of reality, which doesn't say anything goes, but which confronts all of the ways in which we are closed to each other, silencing each other, dominating each other, ignoring each other. God's openness opens us up to the realities of this world just as it is, and to the possibility that things can be different according to the boundless love of God for neighbour and enemy alike. This is good news. Of course, it also provokes all sorts of questions. For example, can the good news at the heart of Christian faith also be evident beyond it? Can the church be so flawed as to be infected by the very problem it seeks to address? Can other traditions and other movements teach the church about how to be the solidarity of the shaken? If we're constantly being shaken out of one thing or another, does that mean there's no chance of rest or escape or final victory? Can this philosopher's lens focused on truth as openness be the key way to understand the whole of the gospel and the whole of how we are called to be in relationship with reality? And so on. But that's what a particular theologian operating on this scale invites us to consider. Does this approach to the Christian gospel resonate with us or not? Does it ring true or not? Does it have a flavour of truth or not? And in what ways? Or where do we experience resistance to it? We must ask ourselves such questions while recognising that Shanks himself invites us to ask such questions. As he says, as a Christian theologian, what I am interested in trying to develop is thus a grand narrative whose central theme would be the historic emergence of the possibility of the solidarity of the shaken, a church which would explicitly identify its own vocation as a kenotic, self-emptying contribution to that larger ideal. So, what do you think?